Hey, I'm Ian. I'm going to be talking to you about some climate-induced mass extinction in a radiation of Australian geckos. My colleague Paul isn't here, so I think I can make some stuff up. Traditional models of macroevolution have kind of assumed, or at least null models have assumed a linear accumulation of species. And the more macroevolutionary studies that come out, the more we realize that the diversification process is really heterogeneous. And we notice this in a few really obvious ways. The first is a phylogenetic fashion. Species imbalances are really obvious across the tree of life. And this is attributable to things like key innovations or ecological shifts across the tree and in specific phylogenetic groups. We also notice this heterogeneity in a temporal sense, so along the branches of the tree. And we generally attribute this to processes like climate or geographic change that are unilaterally influencing groups in a given area. But macroevolutionary studies are often done on islands, small islands, and that's generally a relatively small time scale. And when these macro studies are done on a deeper time scale, it's often across continents and not continuous landmass. So Australia is a particularly fantastic place for this, for macroevolutionary studies, because you have a contained landmass with a deep temporal time scale and some really awesome reptile or squamic reptile radiations. So the group I'm going to be specifically talking about, the Biogeography, presents a really good comparative framework. It's made up of 3 families who have a shared ancestry, and they've diversified in situ in Australia, so they've got they've cohabitated throughout their diversification process. Additionally, there's some really cool morphological and ecological diversity within the group, and some species richness imbalance between the 3 families. The diplodactyls are quite more species rich in Australia. Additionally, there's the fact that the pygopodids are a legless group of geckos, which is just pretty cool anyway. But in picking this specific system, we were really trying to test how we can find signal of climate and climate-induced change on a global and a local scale within a macroevolutionary group. So by charting the diversification process of the Biogeography, we can look at if rates in diversification are consistent temporally, or if they change as we'd expect, and if they're consistent among families. And then on a kind of finer scale, specifically Australian scale, we can look at how the change in these climates may have impacted biomes, and how the changes in biomes have differentially impacted the speciation in these groups. So the first step is to put together a big phylogeny for this group of awesome geckos. We know from previous study that the Pygopodidians are sister group to all other geckos. And so we used a mitochondrial and nuclear base for a fossil-calibrated tree that includes about 155 species and roughly 90% of the extant diversity in Australia. And the first thing you get when you look at the tree is it appears to be broken into 2 really different temporal periods, prior to 30 million years and post 30 million years. There's these quite long bare branches early on in the diversification of the group, and then the kind of clumping of speciation events or branching events closer in time to the present. And we can really quickly test if our group is following a linear process by checking Pybus and Harvey's gamma statistic, which does say that our group deviates from a linear trajectory. But do these bare branches deep in the tree indicate a signal of slow persistence of a few species through time, or is it a signal of high turnover deep in the tree? And this is just another quick way of looking at how the branching events are distributed along the phylogeny, and they're clumped much more closely between about 15 and 5 million years ago. So using a program that's out right now called, or a package called Test and Comment, we can estimate the presence of mass extinction events on top of our phylogeny, and we find temporal support for mass extinction somewhere around 30 million years at that kind of border between our 2 zones of diversification in the Pygopodidia. And this coincides with a change in global temperature that's shown as a histogram on the bottom of the slide. So about 35 million years or so ago at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, Australia separated from Antarctica, which created the circumpolar current and a massive drop in the global temperature, a really rapid one. And this appears coincident with this really big turnover and switch in the Pygopodidia, where a lot of lineages appear to have disappeared. And so this shows that, or this kind of gives some evidence that there has been some really strong heterogeneity along the branches of the tree in the Pygopodidia. And just to kind of visualize it, the first dashed vertical line shows where that Eocene-Oligocene boundary is, and the second dashed line shows where we see this kind of response in our geckos, or in our group. And a bit of a discord between the two may be attributable to variation in confidence intervals in fossil calibrations. And if we exclude the whole extinction a bit and just look at the speciation rate through time, we find it's relatively consistent until about that 30 million year gap, where there's the crown radiation of all three families and congruence in all three families diversifying. And then it speeds up again somewhere around 15 million years ago, which is this kind of second pulse and then an ultimate drop off towards the present that's likely artifactual. So as we've looked down the tree in a temporal sense, we can also look across the tree to compare the lineages within this group. And we see a bit of a lag in the Pygopodids, so the red line at the top, in their response to this extinction event. They follow with their crown divergence about 5 million years later than the other two groups, the diplodactylids in the purple and the carphodactylids in the yellow. But what's notable is that the rates of diversification following this extinction event differ considerably between the three groups. And while there's kind of difference in the rates post-extinction, the general congruence in how they take off or when they take off is pretty surprising. But the vast amount of extant diversity right now has diversified since about the mid-Miocene, about 15 million years ago or so, when the Australian continent changed from this lush forested ecosystem to a much more arid landscape that broke up these mesic biomes into kind of a shell on the outside of the continent. So this rapid aridification occurred about 15 million years ago or so, and we can look at how this broke up our geckos and how it influenced the different diversification of the groups by doing an ancestral state reconstruction for these families. And if we ignore the first 30 million years or so ago, because it's likely impacted by the extinction that we saw earlier, we find that all three families, the crown divergences, reconstruct to different biomes. So the carphodactylids to a forest type, the Pygopodids to a subtropical type, and the diplodactylids to an arid type, which may help to explain some of the imbalance in species richness between the families. But it also shows a certain amount of niche compartmentalization. While the arid zone has shown to be a bit of a suck for species richness in birds and freshwater invertebrates and fish, and mammals particularly, it's been a real boon for reptiles in Australia. And this is particularly evident in this group of geckos, in which the rate of speciation is increased in this arid zone, as well as the outward dispersal from the arid zone back into mesic biomes that were shrinking. So it suggests that the arid zone hasn't been just a sink for diversity, where things have, as the arid zone expanded, things have kind of disproportionately moved into the arid zone, but they've also been moving back out of the arid zone back into other mesic biomes, which is pretty interesting given that as the arid zone expanded, the mammal fauna and bird fauna really decreased or moved towards the edges. So we've got this really quite young arid zone that has an increased rate of species accumulation as well as an increased diversity. But it's also incredibly important as a zone for endemics. About 45% of the taxa within our group are arid zone endemics. And it's interesting to try and justify the success of this group, but we can't really pin it down to any one character. There's potential ecological reasoning. So geckos, most gecko groups are nocturnal, so they can move into this arid zone without getting cooked during the day. But there's also things like the geographic area of the arid zone is the largest of the Australian biomes, and has the greatest amount of perimeter, so you'd expect a bit more dispersal between. And then there's also the potential artifact of elevated extinction from music biomes, so we're potentially losing signal from these other biomes. So just to kind of wrap it up, the diversification of this group has been markedly heterogeneous, with a significant turnover in the assemblage somewhere around 30 million years ago, and a generally congruent post-extinction rebound. But contemporary diversity has really been shaped by the mid-Miocene aridification of the continent. And this climate and climatic change of the Australian continent has really shaped this group of pretty unique geckos. So with that, I just want to thank a few organizations that have helped fund some of this research and some references for some of the analyses I did. That's it.